So she was like, I got this. Have you ever seen any of those? I mean, look at them closely. They're like this big. I don't know. People's feet had to be so tiny and so narrow. No. Yeah, it was just a one pair of shoes. And so it begins.
Well, good afternoon, everyone.
Good afternoon.
Welcome to the Voices of the Past by the DeKalb County Historical Society. I'm known around here as the old farmer. I just recently got that designation. I'm only 83, so I just barely made it, but I'm kind of there now. So. Anyway, hope everybody enjoys things this afternoon. We've got some interesting things for you. I've lived around DeKalb County all my life. I thought I knew about everything. I didn't. But I'm going to learn some this afternoon. Tell you a little bit about the cemetery. This is one of our oldest cemeteries. First burial was 1851. 173 years ago. I kind of wonder what life was like back then, but I'd have to give up my cell phone. I don't know what I'd do.
Yeah.
Grandkids would be worse than me. So anyway, this was just started as a burying ground for DeKalb County people. Just wasn't called cemetery, it was a burying ground. And in 1883, it was declared a cemetery. And if you paid a $2 membership, you didn't have to pay to be buried here. But if you didn't, you could still be buried here for a $25 fee. So that's kind of interesting, but the DeKalb County Commission, excuse me, now takes care of this cemetery. They contract for the mowing, the brush removal, things like that. This afternoon, you're going to hear some interesting things. You'll hear from the nephew of a world-famous poet, the man who served his country in multiple wars, a girl who married at 14, the first sheriff of Clinton County, a murdered judge, a woman who had 15 children, which was not unusual at that time, a reverend, and a Confederate Yankee that ends up in court. And thank you for joining us today. Our first speaker is Eugene. So Eugene, I'll let you introduce yourself.
Well, good afternoon. My name is John Keats, ironically, and I know what you're thinking. You're thinking, aha, John Keats, you are the poet. No, I am the John Keats, the poet nephew. And that's because John Keats' poet's parents had 3 sons. They had the son by the name of John, who is the poet that you're well aware of. They had also had a son by the name of Thomas, and they had a son by the name of George. Well, their mother, tuberculosis was rampant during that time, and John Keats' mother and Thomas and George's mother died of tuberculosis. John Keats, the poet, only lived to the age of 25, and his brother Thomas only lived to be a very young age as well. But I am the third son. So that makes me a nephew to John Keats, the poet. And his father, and that would have been George. That would have been John Keats, poet's brother. Came to America and made his fortune in the Louisville mill industry. So after his father's passing, John trained with his stepfather to learn surveying and civil engineering, spending several years working in Cuba, actually. So interesting there. By 1862, he was living in Warren County, Missouri. And on January 1st of 1862, You know what date that was? That's the beginning of the Civil War. He enlisted in the Union for the war, and he was mustered into the 3rd Regiment of the Missouri State Military Cavalry and initially worked as a nurse in the regiment hospitals. Now, that's interesting how he got into being a medic in the Army, because this is something that a lot of people don't know about his uncle, John Keats, the poet. John Keats the poet, went all the way through medical school. He went all the way through medical school. He became a surgeon's assistant, and they called them apothecaries at that time. But he became a surgeon's assistant, and that's amazing because we think of him as a poet, but medicine was not his first love. His first love was poetry, and that's what he became famous for. But he was a doctor. He went all the way through medical school and did all that. So here's his nephew, also named John. And these little hospitals where they would treat the sick and the wounded soldiers were very small. And the staff there would treat those who were sick and wounded. They were staffed with enlisted surgeons as well as enlisted men serving as nursing staff and sometimes supplemented by women volunteers. And by July of the same year, he was promoted to the rank of hospital steward. In this role, he would have been doing minor surgeries on his own, like his uncle. He would have been acting as a pharmacist. He would have been doing autopsies and ensuring the hospital was well stocked and records kept for the Army. So initially, the 3rd Regiment of the SMM Cavalry saw duty in southeastern Missouri and northeastern Arkansas, and eventually moving farther north around Liberty and St. Joseph near the end of the 1865, and that would be right at the end of the Civil War. And at this time, his regiment was seeing action in northwest Missouri, which could have influenced his decision to settle here in DeKalb County. So by 1870, he was farming near Amity, worked as a county bridge and surveyor and civil engineer, and the particular brand that he actually owned the exclusive device. Now get this, I had owned the rights and the exclusive rights to sell a brand new device called a steam washer. And a steam washer was the precursor to modern day clothes washing machine. There you go. I had something to do with the invention of the washing machine. You can thank me and my ancestors for that. Okay. The particular brand that John sold was marketed as a woman's friend, and the precursor to the modern day machines. In 1880, he married Catherine Bartholomew, and they had one daughter together. Eventually sold their farm and moved to Maysville. And I passed away on May the 7th, 1917, and wife Catherine passed away just over a month later on June the 14th. And they are buried together. We are buried together right here at the Maysville Cemetery.
Well, thank you, Mr. Eugene Keats. I don't know if it's any relation or not, but same name. And we all know nothing ever happens in Maysville. Maybe it did once in a while.
Yeah.
Anyway, our next speaker is Jeffrey. Thank you, Eugene, for all the research you did on that item.
Hello. Hello.
My name is Jacob Holland. I was born in Tennessee on December 21st, 1791. Together with my wife, Elizabeth, we had 10 children, supposedly. I enlisted in the Army service in my home state of Tennessee. I served under a corporal under the command of Major General Andrew Jackson in the War of 1812. Andrew Jackson, of course, would become the 7th President of the United States. I then served again in the Black Hawk War of 1832. I remained in Tennessee until 1836, when my oldest son, Robert, my favorite, and I moved to Missouri. Once in Missouri, we were one of the first white settlers in what is now Sullivan County. My wife and younger children soon followed me. And we all got married in Missouri by 1840. Pretty good time. When the Mexican-American War broke out in 1846, I mustered into the 2nd Missouri Mounted Volunteers as a corporal. I served under the command of Colonel Sterling Price, another well-known historical figure. He later served as governor of Missouri and Confederate general in the Civil War. During this 14 months enlistment, I was wounded and carried a bullet in my arm and the rest of my life, for some reason. I settled in Putnam County. This stay in Missouri was somewhat brief, as I discovery of gold off in California. I was then called a 49er for some reason. I went to search for my gold, supposedly. There's no record that I found gold. But then I moved back here in Missouri for some reason. I moved back to DeKalb County for some reason. My daughter, Stewartsville. In 1861, I enlisted in the Civil War for the Union. At nearly 70 years old, I was enlisted as a teamster for my unit. However, my enlistment was short. I only was there for 22 days before they kicked me out for some reason. Thus, my 4th and last war was pretty short. Though during the Civil War, apparently 2 of my sons joined the Union, 2 Confederate. I disowned the 2 Confederate ones. Throughout my adulthood, I was known as Dr. Holland, though I had no medical education or training. Anything I had was vast knowledge that was based on my life's experience and lab observations. It was enough, apparently. I stayed in Missouri the rest of my life with my children, and I passed away on January 12, 1887. And I am buried here in Little Maysville, Missouri. I'm done. Thank you.
All right.
Good job.
Hey, Jeffrey, I really enjoyed your speech there. It's very interesting. 1887 is recent history in this cemetery. This cemetery's been here a long time. We appreciated all the information you had. It was very interesting. Next up is Mr. Larry, and he's going to tell you some other things.
I'm Larry Zieber. I'm going to represent Littleton S. Roberts. He was born in Kentucky in 1806 to James and Everett Roberts and Sally Letta Ripley Roberts. He passed away August the 22nd, 1893 in Cameron, Missouri at the age of 87. Elizabeth Kincaid Roberts was born October the 4th, 1805 to George Kincaid and Sarah Wilson Kincaid in Harrison County, Kentucky. She died January 29th, 1881 of pneumonia, and so also their eldest daughter, Sarah. Littleton and Elizabeth was married June 2nd, 1885 in Madison, Kentucky. And together they had 11 children, 10 girls, 1 boy, between the 1826 and 1846. For 20 years, Elizabeth was bearing children. It was not, is of this note, that their daughter Harriet was reportedly the first white child born in the newly formed DeKalb County. When they celebrated their 55th anniversary, only 5 of their children were still alive. But they had 28 grandchildren and 4 great-grandchildren. The family began their move to Missouri from Kentucky in 1829, and their second daughter, Sarah, was born on that journey in Indiana. Their family was active as Primitive Baptist Association in Missouri. Their family was known to be kind and generous, often helping many people. Littleton and Elizabeth believed in law and order and service to others. They were lifelong farmers, but Littleton was elected to serve as the first sheriff and collector of Clinton County, Missouri, from 1839 to 1842. He also served as Missouri State Representative from 1858 to 1862. They lived many years on their farm on Highway 33 between Osborne and Maysville. County records show them owning property in townships of Colfax and different parcels in Adams and Grand River. Now, as you all know, that Missouri was a slave state, but for some reason, this little corner of Missouri they had a lot of abolitionists. And on the 13th of June, 1863, the citizens of Maysville, led by Littleton Roberts as the chair of the newly formed committee, and joined on this committee were Captain Holland, E.J. Bronson, Captain T. Smith, Judge T. Kitsumcom, George Sherman, Z. Provost, Captain George Brown, Manford Lancaster, and Jackson Hawkins. They appointed Roberts, Littleton's son, secretary to set about drafting resolutions expressing of the citizens of DeKalb County. George Wyatt, Sam Riggs, and Sylvester Crank all spoke. All these gentlemen spoke against slavery. So then here's the resolutions they came up with. There was 5 of them. Number 1, we, the people of DeKalb County, in mass meeting assembled, are in favor of immediate emancipation of all slavery in the state of Missouri. Number 2, that we are in favor of the most vigorous prosecution of the war until every rebel copperhead is willing to submit to the authority of the United States or be exterminated from the country. That we have explicit confidence in the President of the United States, believing him to be heaven's choice to conduct the affairs of this nation through this rebellion, and he should be supported and upheld every honest person, male, female, in this nation. Number 4, that is, the question of emancipation shall come before the legislature as its adjourned session in November endeavors to pass a law prohibiting all disloyal persons from voting at every election in his state. And he is further instructed to pass a law prohibiting every disloyal person, male, female, from holding office or teaching school, either public or by subscription, in this state. And number 5, we view the Copperheads as the meanest enemy we have to contend with in this rebellion, a disgrace to themselves and to the rest of mankind. Now, in the later years, their daughter Nancy married George Smith, and they had 1 son, Robert Burns Smith. In a letter, Elizabeth wrote that they practically raised their grandson Robert, who later married Elizabeth Jane Hyder. They had a daughter, Marietta Smith. In 1880, Robert headed to Texas with plans to buy several thousand acres when it became available. The plan was for Elizabeth and Etta to join him. Littleton and Elizabeth wrote many letters to R.B. Smith asking that she and Etta come and visit. Robert's dream was not fulfilled. In 1882, the quarantine doctor of the St. Louis and San Francisco Railroad Company sent a letter stating he had died of smallpox and gave the location of his grave. A few years later, on Tuesday, November the 17th, 1885, Littleton married for the second time to a widow, Miss Harriet Elizabeth Howard, in Plattsburgh, Missouri. She was 30 and he was 80, according to their marriage license. He lived to be 87 and is buried next to Elizabeth here in the cemetery, along with 2 other children. That's it.
Nice job. Very good. Nice job.
Yeah.
Well, thank you, Mr. Larry Zieber. I learned a lot of things that I didn't know, and I'm sure glad I was not a copperhead. It would have been sort of dangerous, I think. Our next speaker, next presentation is Janice. Janice?
Hi, everybody.
Closer. The mic.
Closer?
There you go.
Too short. Vertically challenged. I'm Mary Farrar Titcomb, and I was born May 12, 1812, in Massachusetts. I married in 1830. My husband, Timothy Batchelder Titcomb, was born in north of Dartmouth, Maine, on July 31st, 1803. Timothy's parents were Samuel and Maris Batchelder Titcomb of old New England families, some who came to the New World in 1634. After our marriage, we moved to Ohio, Illinois, Iowa, before we finally settled on a farm by Fairport, Missouri. We purchased 160 acres on June 12, 1854 for $1,000 cash. We built a large 5-bedroom house with 2 parlors and a pantry. In 1864, Timothy was elected one of 3 judges for DeKalb County and was reappointed to this position in 1865 by the governor. Timothy and I had 5 children: Edward, Albina, Lydia, Stephanie, and Amra, born between 1832 and 1849. All the children married except for Stephanie, who stayed on the family farm with us. Our oldest, Edward, tried to divorce his wife and was unsuccessful. She came back and sued him for defamation of character, harsh and abusive treatment, and was successful in getting a divorce. They had been married for 10 years. He moved in with us to help with the farm. By 1871, there had been a number of instances where Edward had disagreements with numerous family members, especially his brother-in-law. They were always started by him, were always one-sided, and were always just words. But on Saturday, July 1st, 1871, he had a disagreement with his father over some hay. His father, trying to get away from the situation, said, "Do as you please," and started to walk away. But Edward responded by tackling his father and knocking him to the ground. 2 of his sisters came to their father's defense, and he was able to get up and escape, getting on horseback and running to the neighbors. Edward responded by trying to choke one of his sisters and leaving bruises around her neck and dislocating the shoulder of the other one. He then came after me with an axe and threatened to split my head open if I did not return his gun to him. I begged him to please not do anything, and he promised me he wouldn't. He got on his horse and went straight to the neighbors. When he reached the neighbors, he confronted his father, and then he shot him 3 times, in the leg, in the arm, and in the abdomen. He then took his horse and went into town, talked to an attorney who told him he needed to turn himself in to the sheriff, which he did. Good thing, because they were getting a lynch mob together to hang him. I sent a letter to him in jail and addressed it to my wretched son. I informed him that his murderous work had been but too complete, that his old father of 70 years and 10 had died of his wounds, and asked him, "How could you do this?" Timothy died in the hospital in St. Joseph on Monday night, so he suffered for 2.5 days. Edward was sentenced to 20 years in the state penitentiary on November 16, 1872. He was later given a conditional pardon by Governor Crittenden on July 4, 1883. He spent the rest of his life at the Missouri State Mental Hospital. Edward died April 9, 1903. I continued to live with Stephanie on the farm until my own death, June 27, 1889. Timothy and I are buried here at the Maysville Cemetery side by side. And I'll just add to this, there was a lot of newspaper articles and things, and the more I dug into Edward, He served in the Civil War. And I think he came back from the Civil War a changed man. And I think he probably had PTSD, which of course back then was not recognized. And so, you know, he never got the help he needed. This is a tragedy that should have never happened, but it is the way life went. And it was, you know, you don't know what you don't know. So I'll just say that. I'm not trying to defend him. He still murdered his dad, but, you know, I think there were extenuating circumstances surrounding it all. So. I think you're next.
Thank you very much, Janice Bennett. That's very interesting. I would like to buy 160 acres at Fairport. The fact is, if that would pay the closing cost, I'd be happy.
Yeah.
Anyway, our next presenter is Beverly.
Hello, friends. It's good to see all of you here today. My name is Paulina Todd Jennings Truman. I was born on February 5th of 1814 in Kentucky, United States. My father, Peyton Randolph Jennings, was 21, and my mother, Nancy Todd, was 24 when I was born. I married Edward Truman on March 28th of 1828 in Owen, Kentucky, in the United States at the age of 14. My future husband, Edward, and my uncle, Howard Todd, signed for the 50 pounds for our marriage bond. Marriage bonds were a practice brought over to the colonies from England and were used well into the 19th century, even up until the Civil War, through the close of that war. In the states that kept this practice, there is only a bond registered. There is no marriage license or marriage certificate. This bond was a promise that the two parties were legally able to marry, in that they were of age or were signed for, and that they were not already married to somebody else. And it was a guarantee that a marriage between them would occur. The bondsmen were generally the groom and another family member or close friend of the bride. There was no money actually paid unless the marriage fell through. The 50 pounds is what the fine would have been should Edward and I not have gotten married after this bond was signed. 50 pounds was the standard amount in Kentucky for this time period, but it was quite a significant amount at that same time. We were the proud parents of 4 sons and 7 daughters. We had our first 7 children in Kentucky. We then moved from Kentucky to Wapello, Iowa in 1850. We had our next 3 children in Iowa. We then moved to Daviess County, Missouri in 1854, where our last child was born. In 1860, we bought land and moved over to DeKalb County in Missouri. On April 6th of 1862, we lost our firstborn son, Walter, in the Civil War. Walter died at the Battle of Shiloh, Tennessee. He served in the Iowa Grand Army of the Republic and was attached to Company K, 7th Infantry. He was buried in 1862 at the Shiloh National Military Park in Hardin County, Tennessee. Iowa Post W. Truman, number 442, Abingdon, was named in his honor. On March 15th of 1865, at the age of 51, I left this world. A small stone marks my grave in this cemetery, and my name is misspelled on the stone. It's spelled Perlina instead of Paulina, which I think probably was a pet name for my husband. My husband Edward and several of the other children then moved to Elko County in Nevada. He and our sons ran a supply freight business. They carried mineral and other supplies clear up to Montana and then picked up needed supplies and brought them back to Elko. Some trips took nearly a year. Edward died October 14th of 1887 and is buried in Elko. Although we were separated in death, we are joined in heaven. Thank you.
Thank you, Beverly Mollsberger. That was very interesting. You know, I've always wondered, back in those years, they moved around a lot from state to state, and I wondered how they did it, because a horse going 2 or 3 miles an hour would take forever. Plus just the logistics of food, everything, and with several kids. There was always several kids.
Yeah.
Next presentation, Kathy.
Good afternoon. My name is Phoebe Ellsworth Whitchurch. I was born October 8, 1812 to John and Phoebe Ellsworth in Warren County, Kentucky. I will be 212 next month. By 1822, our family was settled in St. Clair, Illinois. There on April 1st, 1829, I married John Whitchurch at the age of 16. John was the son of William and Elizabeth Howe Whitchurch. He was born July 2nd, 1809, near Knoxville, Tennessee, into a large family. There were eventually 10 boys and 5 girls in his family. In 1820, his family moved to a farm in St. Clair County, Illinois, near Fayetteville, Illinois. This farm was 320 acres and next to his wife's brother, David W. Howe. There were a lot of Indians in the area and a lot of wild animals, although his greatest childhood dangers were prairie fires and malaria. John's father died in 1848, and in 1849 we moved to DeKalb County, Missouri, close to where John's twin brothers, Civilian and Sylvanus, were living in Maysville. We were among the first settlers in the area. We bought and sold several tracts of land and finally settled on 80 acres just north of Maysville in Camden Township. The last 4 of our 12 children, 9 boys and 3 girls, 9 of whom lived to adulthood, were born on that farm. Some of our children who died young are buried in the farm. In 1860, we took in Hannah Doty, aged 11. She needed help, and so did I, running a household full of mostly boys. John spent his life as a farmer and a carpenter. We were active members of the Baptist Church in Maysville. John was selected to draw up rules of order for the meetings, and he was known and referred to as Parson Whitchurch. He performed the marriage ceremony of one of our daughters, and it was a proud occasion for him. One of John's proudest possessions was his father's rifle from the War of 1812, along with his powder horn. This treasure has continued to be passed down in the family. His father fought with Andrew Jackson at the Battle of New Orleans. Yes, Andrew Jackson became the 7th President of the United States. John died at home on the farm June 4th, 1884, and is buried in the Maysville Cemetery. He was 74. After he died, I lived with our son Robert, who repaired and installed pumps and windmills, and his family, including their baby, a son. They were living in Winstonville towards Winston. I later lived with our older son, Benjamin J. He was a teacher, a farmer, and a justice of the peace. They had 2 living children at home. 2 others had died, and were in Jefferson Township, Daviess County, Missouri. I died while living with them, and I'm buried beside John here at the Maysville Cemetery.
Thank you, Kathy, Hyatt, Keggy. Both families have a lot of history in DeKalb County, and I think most of us know that. Anyway, I thought I was in a large family. I'm the oldest one of 8 kids. I wasn't. A lot of these families were 15 kids. That seemed to be the number. And taking care of them with, without our modern conveniences we have today, I just can't even fathom that. Can't even fathom that. Thank you, Kathy, very much. Our next presenter is Greg.
Good afternoon, everyone.
Good afternoon.
My name is John Everard Moore. I was born in Somerset, New Jersey in the year of 1830. I was born the youngest of 8 children, 7 boys and 1 girl. My father, Benjamin Gillette Moore, and my mother, Mary Cohn Moore, immigrated from New Jersey to Canton, Illinois when I was 10 years old. The trip took 9 weeks since we traveled by horse teams. Upon settling in Canton, my father was involved in the community and supervised the installing of the machinery in the first wooden mill there. He also united with the Baptist church there, as did our entire family. I myself was brought under the saving grace of God and was converted to Christ at the age of 14 and was baptized by Reverend Mr. Newell into the Baptist church in Canton, Illinois. My brother Eugene, who was 2 years older than myself and a very studious person, also felt an intense interest in Christian work. He never did complete his college education due to circumstances of life, being newly married and with the passing of my father in 1851. He began to exercise the gift of preaching and was licensed by the Baptist Church of Monmouth, Illinois in 1856. It was assumed that I, the younger brother, would assume responsibilities of the farm and care for my aged parents. I started on a path as an apprentice to a carriage maker, but it wasn't long before I decided to enter Shirtliff College in Upper Alton, Illinois, and commence studies for the gospel ministry. While in college, I pursued my studies as well as a young lady named Anne Elizabeth Moore. I graduated in 1854 and married Anne in July. I had been preaching part-time in different churches throughout my college career. I loved to preach the gospel. After graduation, we moved to Auburn in the Shawnee area of the Kansas Territory, where my son Charles was born in 1858. Upon the outbreak of the Civil War, we moved back to the family home in Illinois, where I entered the 154th Illinois Infantry at Camp Butler and served as a chaplain throughout the war. I also served a short time with the 133rd Illinois Infantry as a mechanic, calling on my training gained during my apprenticeship with carriages. I mustered out of the military in 1865 and continued my preaching duties. I came to Missouri in 1870, locating in DeKalb County. My home was located in Standard, Missouri, in Sherman Township, near Stewartsville. I began preaching, and by 1875 was the pastor of 3 churches at the same time, spending half of my time at the Baptist church in Maysville, the county seat. I was not only the preacher, but assisted my congregants with legal matters of probate and other scholarly matters. In the year 1875, I began to realize that my work on earth was coming to a close, although I was only 45 years old. I began to have symptoms of what was called brain fever. Today, it would most likely be called encephalitis or meningitis. I did not want to stop preaching, however. It was said that knowing my time was short, that my preaching seemed anointed anew with the Holy Spirit, and my last sermons were full of love, but also an urgency toward sharing the gospel. The Record Herald newspaper listed a sermon titled, "The Way Men Are Witnesses for Christ," for the title in May of 1875. It was a continuation of the previous sermon. I strive not only to share messages of intellectual and moral qualities, but ones full of Christ. I departed this earthly life on December 5th, 1875, leaving my wife Anne and 4 children. We had a total of 7 children, 3 passed in infancy. Two of them are buried here in this cemetery near me. Fidelia and Mary, who were less than 2 years old, share a stone here. My oldest son, Charles, married Lula Burnett here in DeKalb County in 1881. Soon they were attracted to the Indian Territory in Oklahoma, made a run in the land rush, and staked a claim in Kingfisher County, where they moved in 1890. My widowed wife, Ann, moved there as well and lived with my son, Charles, who became county treasurer. He was considered a pioneer of that area. Several of my other children found their way to Oklahoma as well. Ann had always been active in church work as well, teaching Sunday school and continued doing other ministry for as long as she could. She died in Oklahoma in 1809, serving the Lord until the end. The Baptist Church in Maysville continued to survive and grow and is active today in the same location where I preached and prayed nearly 150 years ago. To God be the glory.
Thank you, Pastor Greg Dixon, pastor of First Baptist Church in Maysville, still preaching the Word of God 150-some years later. What more can you say? Won't say anymore. Next presenter is Kyle.
My name is George Warren Cubble, and I was born in Hoosick Falls in Rensselaer County, New York. I was born in April of 1836. For a point of reference, America, United States, was only 60 years old at that point. Hoosick Falls is in rural New York, nowhere near the big city, and only a couple miles from the border with Vermont. I was the oldest of 6 children, all born in New York. By the time I became a young adult, our family had relocated to the town of Alexander, New York, in Genesee County. And in that town, a Methodist Episcopal seminary had opened. And this school eventually became Genesee College. In later years, it became Syracuse University. I had aspirations to study law, and I graduated from that college in 1857. And that year, I decided to go west. A lot of people were doing that. I went west and settled in, found myself in the town of Maysville, Missouri, in DeKalb County. And it had only been founded a dozen years earlier as the county seat. And although I had studied law, I began as a school teacher. But I did practice law as well. I became acquainted with Judge Hewitt and his family here, and began to practice law, splitting my time between Maysville and Plattsburgh. Judge Eli Hewitt trained many lawyers here, including his son Robert and a young man named James T. Blair, who eventually became the governor of the state of Missouri, the 44th governor. And I was admitted to the bar for legal profession in 1860 by a man named Elijah Norton. He was an attorney in Platte County, and he eventually became a judge on the Missouri Supreme Court. I practiced law in Maysville until the outbreak of the Civil War, where I joined the Confederate Army. That's right, Sheriff. I don't believe I was a proponent of slavery, but I was a very strong Democrat. And that's what Democrats seem to do.
That's right.
So we did that. I was granted a commission as a captain at 25 years old in the 3rd Missouri Infantry, Company E. By 1862, I had risen to the rank of 2nd lieutenant. And I remained in the infantry until I was wounded at Franklin, Tennessee, and I was incarcerated as a prisoner of war at Fort Delaware in December of 1864. I remained captive there until the end of the war and was released in June of 1865. At that time, I took the oath of allegiance to rejoin the Union as a citizen in good standing. I returned to the practice of law, and in September of that year, I married Eli Hewitt's daughter, Elizabeth Mary Hewitt. She had returned from Maysville, from Baltimore, where she had gone to do her extended schooling, and returned to Maysville. We were married in St. Joseph and spent a lot of time traveling between several different cities. I actually came to Nebraska City in Nebraska, September 16th of 1865, and was engaged in teaching at a collegiate institute with a man named B.W. Vineyard. That lasted about a year until 1866. Next, I opened a private academy, and in which I taught until June of 1867, again, about a year. And so at that point, I was elected principal of the high school, a position I held for 1 year. So I was then appointed to the Board of Education, superintendent of the schools of Nebraska City, a position I held for not quite a year, a few months. When in the summer of 1868, I finally began the practice of law in Nebraska. Our family began as well, with 2 children being born over the next few years. Sadly, both children died in their childhood. Eugenia, born in 1869, lived 4 years, and Herbert, born in 1870, lived less than a year. At this time, I also began getting involved in legislative politics. So, living and working in Missouri and in Nebraska, I served as the Nebraska State Representative for Otoe County in 1871 and 72. That was the state legislature. I also served in the Senate in Nebraska in the years 1877 to 78. I continued to practice law as well, and we welcomed a daughter, Anna, into our family in 1879. Anna was our only child to live into adulthood, and she took after her mother in many regards. I moved to Omaha, Nebraska in 1887, leaving Maysville, becoming a partner in a law firm of Covell and Winters. I was a partner in that firm. So aside from my law practice, I dealt to a considerable extent in real estate. I laid out a block of the city called the Covell Addition near the Institute for the Deaf and Mute in Omaha. I also spent a considerable amount of time in fraternal affairs, becoming a Mason, becoming a Knight Templar, and a member of the Mystic Shrine. The story of my life would not be complete without the story of my wife, who was an important person in her own right. Following my death in 1916, Elizabeth Covell remained a strong and outspoken proponent of women's causes. After moving to Nebraska City from Maysville in 1887, she became widely known in the community and in the newspapers, including some well-known debates and arguments that caused many society meetings to be written about for the entertainment of the readership. She had a few things to say. After moving a charter member of the Omaha Women's Club, she was an ardent member of the Women's Christian Temperance Union, and she was a militant suffragist. She paraded for women's right to vote and for abolishing the use of alcohol. She was also a member of the Daughters of the Confederacy and a proud member of the Democratic Party. When the Democratic Party moved towards the repeal of prohibition, which she was fighting for, her loyalty to them wavered, but she eventually acquiesced to majority rule. Her passing in 1935 was met with headlines in the Omaha papers as readers remembered the many causes she championed. Our daughter Anna never married, but she remained a well-known and respected member of Omaha society. Over the many years that our family lived in Nebraska City, we very often returned to Maysville to visit family and friends. Although my wife and daughter would eventually be buried elsewhere, I was laid to rest here, a place many of our relatives still call home.
Thank you, Kyle. That's the end of our presentations today. We hope you enjoyed it. We've all heard nothing happens in Maysville. Well, I hope you don't think that now. A lot of things have happened in Maysville. And one of the things I was thinking about, and I just wrote an article on this, but women received the right to vote 4 years ago. Can't believe it. Can't believe it.
Can't believe they gave it to him, or what?
I better know that. No, that was even a problem. That they needed to legislate that. And also, I feel kind of bad. These last two guys are all dressed up, and here I am. You know, you guys look nice anyway.
You're dressed as the old farmer.
All right. But anyway, thank you very much to the ones who worked so hard to get this done. It takes quite a bit of work for this. Several did it, you know who you are. And also, as usual, we don't charge a thing for any of our presentations. However, we do have a contribution box over here. If you wish to contribute to keep history alive in DeKalb County, feel free. We appreciate it. And also, there's so much history across the street here, or across the fence. Same way on the other side of the football field. Just go around the cemetery and take a look at some of the stones. And Kyle is going to lead a procession if you want to go out there and look around. These stones that we've talked about today are all marked. So have a good time. Glad you were here. Thank you very much for being here.
Hey, John, I want to ask something. I noticed during the presentations that a lot of the people they talked about, their ancestors came here from Kentucky, as did mine. Do you know why that was? Why there were?
I've often wondered that. Several of them came from Kentucky, Tennessee, a lot of them. And Germany, Switzerland, Ireland before that. Followed the railroad, and as I said earlier, I wonder about the transportation at that time.
I think
1859 or so.
I think sometimes it depends on when states join the union. People
when
would
territory opens up.
Territory would open up. They would settle there, and then when a new one would open it up, more opportunities, they would move there. A lot of people came from Ohio as well. Seemed like from Kentucky and Ohio.
Yeah.
And some in the South moved away from the Civil War that they saw coming.
True.
Also,
Yeah, true.
I've lived there, and if you want to farm, you either have to have family that had a farm. It's nothing's flat. So if you want to farm, move this way.
Yeah, that's right.
My relatives all moved to Platte County from pre-Civil War, and they all came to farm.
Well, they kept moving west to the frontier, and that was part of it. And also, a lot of the feelings of the Civil War were very avid, we'll say, for want of a better word. But
that they were poor.
But there are Confederate sympathizers buried over here. There are Union sympathizers buried over here. We are a very diverse county, and it's really interesting when you start looking into things.
I think one of the things I thought was really interesting because we literally put together just a list by date of birth to try and keep everybody in kind of the same period, not knowing any of the history. And then as we started doing the research on people, seeing the way those people's lives intertwined here and how they fought for the same causes or married into each other's families and that kind of thing. And I thought that was extremely interesting, you know. So.
It is. And another thing that's interesting is like 17, 18, 19, 20. They lost a lot of, particularly children and adults, from the flu epidemic.
Flu epidemic, yeah.
And there are a lot of stones over here, monuments over here from that time period. Yeah.
And that's what you find a lot of those days.
And a lot of people died of what they called consumption, which today is tuberculosis.
You're right. That in your presentation, 45, something like that.
51.
Yeah. So, I'm 83. I've been blessed.
Yes, you have.
That's all I can say. I want to leave you with one thought. Life is good in DeKalb County. It really is.